Next on Secrets of War, it was perhaps the most important battle of World War II, D-Day. As the future of Europe and the world hung in the balance, an intricate web of lies hid the when, where, and how of the Allied landings at Normandy. From double agents to phantom armies, the battle behind the battle, D-Day Deceptions, is next on Secrets of War.
The 6th of June, 1944. As dawn breaks over Western Europe, a savage naval barrage pounds the coast of France. Thousands of British, American, Canadian, French, and Polish soldiers storm onto the beaches of Normandy. "20,000 paratroops have already landed in an attempt to take strategic points inland. By the end of the day, nearly 150,000 men will have come ashore. The largest amphibious assault in history. The liberation of Europe is underway. But the Battle of Normandy had really begun more than a year earlier. It had been a campaign of wits, secrets, and deception. For D-Day to be successful, the element of surprise was critical. Indeed, essential. The plans for the Allied invasion of France were among the most important and closely guarded secrets of the entire war. In the summer of 1943, Lieutenant General Frederick Morgan, the acting Chief of Staff to the Supreme Allied Commander, presented the initial plans of Operation Overlord. In it, he outlined the objectives, needs, and conditions for the invasion of France. The plan called for massive amounts of men and material from the United States and for complete air superiority. In addition, Morgan stated that the plan required a much higher standard of performance than any previous operation. But the report acknowledged that the invasion had only a reasonable chance of success. The task facing the liberation forces was daunting. The Wehrmacht, a German war machine, was the most powerful fighting force in the world. It was comprised of over 300 divisions, nearly 4 million men. In the winter of 1943, 46 of those divisions were in Belgium and France. By D-Day, there would be more than 60. Conventional military tactics dictated that attackers should outnumber the defenders by at least 2 to 1. But the Allies would be able to land only about 10 divisions on D-Day. Also facing the Allies was the problem of the Atlantic Wall, the complex of concrete, barbed wire and massive guns that stretched from Scandinavia to Spain. Begun in 1940, soon after the occupation of France, the Atlantic Wall was still not completed by the winter of 1943. Yet Hitler believed that once completed, it would be invincible.
Hitler was very much the man for the grand statement and the grand design, the idea of a Festung Europa, a fortress Europe, with an Atlantic wall that would throw back the Anglo-American hordes when they tried to do it, was very much part of the Hitlerian concept of the grand design of history. He believed certainly this massive concrete barrier on the Atlantic wall was in places immensely effective.
Today, more than 50 years after it was commissioned as the first line of defense of Fortress Europe, the Atlantic Wall is still imposing and ominous. The remnants of the concrete bunkers, metal obstacles, and the great guns stand in mute witness to what transpired here more than half a century ago. In November of 1943, Hitler issued his Directive 51, in which he predicted that the Allies would invade in the spring of 1944. He promised that he would no longer weaken his Western defenses in favor of other fronts. To this end, he ordered the strengthening of the Atlantic Wall. In December, Hitler's most trusted and charismatic general, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, came to France to inspect the wall. Rommel had gained a reputation as a brilliant tactician in the deserts of North Africa. But since being driven from the deserts, he'd been relegated to a low-profile position in northern Italy. In January of 1944, he was made commander of Army Group B and put in charge of the Atlantic Wall.
There was still a feeling that Rommel was at the peak of his tactical capabilities as a commander. He had the respect of the troops. To a certain extent, there was a feeling that Rommel's presence would be a morale booster because he had been so successful in the early campaigns in North Africa. He was a man of flexible thinking. He was a good tactician. And if anything was going to go wrong, then Rommel would be the man on the spot to be able to put that right.
Rommel was one of the two army commanders in France under Rundstedt. He was put there because A, he was one of the best generals Hitler had got. B, Hitler thought correctly that the English were frightened of him.
Rommel's first order of duty was to upgrade the wall's defenses. Within weeks, he'd increased the rate at which the Germans were laying mines from 40,000 to more than 1 million a month. By May, soldiers and slave laborers had laid more than 500,000 obstacles along the French coastline. If Hitler stationed enough of his troops at the Allies' point of attack, the Atlantic Wall might well be the impregnable barrier he sought. But the bulk of Germany's manpower was scattered throughout Europe. More than half, over 150 divisions, were engaged on the Russian fronts.
There's great pressure on the Allies coming from Stalin that Stalin has been asking for what he calls a second front since 1942. And the United States and England have been holding him off. He is convinced that there's some kind of plot against him by this time because he felt that surely there should have been an invasion in 43.
Certainly the truth of the delays of a second front, I don't think it was for the want of trying, but I think it was absolutely certain that the British and the Americans felt that they would really only have one proper crack at it, and you couldn't get it wrong.
Not getting it wrong would take more than the continued dissipation of German forces in Russia. The plans for overlords stated that success would also be reliant upon unspecified diversionary operations.
The cover and deception plans for Normandy
were born of the slaughter of World War I on Flanders Plains and on the Somme, when the British lost 60,000 men before breakfast in the first assault. Churchill was resolved never to fight a war again in that fashion and decided instead to select a policy of artifice, leaving the enemy baffled as well as beaten, as he put it.
Winston Churchill established a secret committee called the London Controlling Section, or LCS, with just such operations in mind. It had no powers to carry out its own plans. It was only charged with inventing the intrigues and plotting the deceptions that would serve as cover plans for military operations. The chairman of the committee, called the Controller of Deception, was Colonel John Henry Bevan. A peacetime stockbroker, Bevan had served as an officer in the cavalry in the First World War and had been awarded the Military Cross.
And he too agreed with Churchill that it would be impossible to fight World War II in the same fashion, because the civilian populations would not accept casualties on those scales again, nor would the army fight for that matter.
Bevan's small committee convened beneath the streets of Westminster in Churchill's secret war rooms. In July, they were given the task of creating cover operations for Overlord and for Operation Neptune, the amphibious assault itself.
If you're going to attack France across the Channel, there are a variety of options of where you're going to go. But quite clearly, you have to start thinking about making the enemy look in the wrong place. And the London Controlling Section was the central point for an awful lot of this making the enemy look the other way.
The LCS came up with two plans. The first was to mislead the Germans as to where the Allied armies would attack. It included feints and deceptive operations planned to cause Hitler to scatter his forces throughout Europe, from Scandinavia to the Mediterranean. The second plan was designed specifically to obscure the time, date, and place of the Allied invasion of France. The overall deception plan, codenamed JL, was presented to the Allied Chiefs of Staff in October of 1943. Approved in December, the plan was renamed Bodyguard, a title which may have been inspired by a quote attributed to both Churchill and Stalin. In wartime, truth is so precious that she should always be attended by a bodyguard of lies.
Secrets of War will continue in a moment here on the History Channel. We now return to Secrets of War.
When General Dwight David Eisenhower arrived in England in January of 1944, the plans for Operation Overlord had been in motion for more than 6 months. But as the newly appointed Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, it was his job to see that those plans were refined and executed. He had a reputation of being a proficient soldier and a composed, if sometimes hesitant, commander. General George S. Patton brought an entirely different reputation to England. A hero in North Africa and Sicily, he was known as a consummate leader and a brilliant technician. A tough-as-nails soldier, his men had nicknamed him Blood and Guts. An incident in which he'd slapped a soldier hospitalized for battle fatigue had many stateside calling for his court-martial. But everyone, even the German High Command, believed that any invasion of Fortress Europe would involve Patton. He was put in command of the 1st United States Army Group stationed in Kent in southeast England. The 1st United States Army Group, or FUSAG as it was known, was made up of the 1st Canadian Army and the American 3rd Army. An additional 50 American divisions were to join the group once a beachhead had been established. It was a formidable fighting force, and it was a lie. The 1st United States Army Group didn't exist. It was an invention of the London Controlling Section. Patton was the focal point of one of the most elaborate deceptions of the war.
Here are the planners of the deception plan, and they have created a fake army, and they've gone to a great deal of trouble. They've got to have a general really in charge of it. And they look around and they come up with Patton, General Patton. Germans have got to know that Patton is going to be in the invasion. He's a general they know they're going to fear.
The aim of Fortitude South was to convince the Germans that the target of the upcoming invasion was the Pas-de-Calais, some 150 miles northeast of the actual invasion site. By doing so, it was hoped that Hitler would hold the Panzer divisions stationed there until after a beachhead had been established in Normandy. It played on the Germans' preconceived notions about the most likely site for an invasion.
The Germans were convinced that the Pas-de-Calais area was going to be the site of a future invasion. And I think this reflects the very land-based philosophy which their armed forces had. They had no experience of amphibious warfare at all. So they thought in terms that the shortest sea crossing was going to be the quickest one, and therefore the one which the Allies would take.
It was, in fact, the same area the Germans had planned to use for Operation Sea Lion, their unrealized plan for the invasion of England. It was only 22 miles from the British coast, so that troops and materials could be ferried across the channel to the invasion beaches quickly, and so that the strong Allied air forces could easily fly over targets and return to their British bases. But there were other reasons Hitler believed that the Pas-de-Calais was a primary target of the Allied invasion plans. The V-1 and V-2 missile sites, which would soon rain terror down on London, were in that area. And it was in a direct line to the Ruhr, the industrial heartland of Germany. Despite these strategic considerations, the initial plans for Overlord had discounted the Pas-de-Calais, citing its beaches as being too shallow for a large-scale landing. As D-Day approached, real troops from Fusag joined the forces preparing for the Normandy landing and were replaced by false or notional divisions. Many of these divisions had been created as part of deceptive operations in Africa and remained in the German estimates of the Allied order of battle. By reporting that these units had been transferred to England, the Allies increased the German assessment of Fusag's strength. The 50 divisions that were to join Fusag after the invasion had never existed at all.
Now, it's easy perhaps to write off this particular means of strategic deception by saying, well, the Germans had no aerial reconnaissance over the south of England in the summer of '44, so who was going to see these things? But at the time, the British and Americans were by no means sure that there were no German agents operating in the south of England. Also, there were neutral diplomats in London, not all of whom were particularly favourable to the Allied cause. So it was important to cover every angle. The planners for the Overlord landings were charged with the safe transport of thousands of British, American, Canadian, Polish, French troops over on the day, and they had to consider everything.
On the 6th of June, there were nearly 250,000 men, some of Germany's best divisions stationed in the Pas-de-Calais. Divisions that could easily have been on the Atlantic Wall in Normandy.
Secrets of War will continue in a moment here on the History Channel. We now return to Secrets of War.
In spring of 1944, less than 2 months before the Allied landings at Normandy, a lone Luftwaffe aircraft strafed the wireless station of the British Fourth Army in Edinburgh, Scotland. No one was hurt, and the station resumed broadcasting soon after. It was the only combat the British Fourth Army would see, because other than a handful of wireless stations, there was no British Fourth Army. It was another phantom conjured by the London controlling section. Fortitude North was an operation designed to take advantage of Hitler's obsession with Scandinavia.
When Hitler invades Norway, there's a great resistance group that springs up in Norway, and there starts to be ideas, well, maybe this would be a way to invade Europe. doesn't make an awful lot of sense when you get down to really planning it in terms of logistics, in terms of season, and so on. But the deception planners get a hold of this and say, well, let's build up a deception plan that looks like the possibility of an invasion through Norway.
By creating a false army in Scotland, the LCS hoped to convince Hitler that an invasion of Norway was being planned, and by doing so, keep him from pulling his forces out of Scandinavia to reinforce the French coast. By the end of 1943, there were more than 300,000 German troops stationed in Norway, including a panzer division. But Hitler had good reason to protect his Norwegian holdings.
Almost all of his iron ore and steel came from the Swedish ore fields. If he'd lost that, the Ruhr industries would have had no raw materials. The war would have come to an end. To a certain extent, he was right. We played his game there from the first days of the war until the last days of the war.
The commander-in-chief of the notional British Army was Lieutenant General Sir Andrew Thorne. Like General Patton, his counterpart in Fortitude South, Thorne was chosen by the LCS to get Hitler's attention. While serving as the military attaché to Berlin in 1934, Thorne had met Hitler at a formal reception. Hitler recognized the medals Thorne wore as those awarded to veterans of the Battle of Ypres, where Hitler himself had first seen action in World War I. The divisions which made up Thorne's army were not entirely notional. There was a great deal of activity in the north of Great Britain in early 1944. Of the 8 divisions that initially comprised the artificial army, only the 55th U.S. Division was totally false. The others, while stationed or training in the area, were never assigned to the British Fourth Army. Other bogus divisions were added until the fictional force exceeded 250,000 men. Due to the growing strength of the Allied air forces and the notoriously unpredictable Scottish weather, there was very little, if any, German aerial reconnaissance over northern Great Britain in the spring of 1944. So, unlike Fortitude South, little was done in the way of visual deceptions. Other means were used to give the false army life.
In order to carry conviction with these phantom divisions, they'd have wireless squadrons up there, making noises like an army, sending messages backwards and forwards as if there were tank brigades were on the move, practicing and all the rest of it.
Radio stations were set up around Scotland, in Dundee, Stirling, and in the Army's headquarters at Edinburgh Castle. By the second week of April 1944, a handful of officers and wireless operators were simulating the radio traffic of an entire army. But radio wasn't the only means of deception used to convince the Germans of the Army's existence or of its intentions. Double agents working for the British sent messages to their German controllers corroborating the Army's presence, citing troop movements and describing the insignia of non-existent divisions. Double agents also reported that the Soviets had established an office in Scotland to coordinate a joint invasion. The Russians, working with the Western Allies, leaked disinformation about an unspecified Arctic invasion scheduled for June. Information was planted in the civilian press about sporting and social events involving the men of the Fourth Army. In late May and early June, the Allies stepped up aerial reconnaissance over Scandinavia, and Russian submarines were spotted patrolling the Norwegian coast. British commandos executed a series of small raids against German installations in Norway. Shipping was sunk, oil refineries destroyed, power stations, industrial plants, and mines were hit, in the type of actions that generally precede an invasion. Sweden was also a target of and an unwilling participant in Fortitude North. Though neutral, Sweden traded heavily with the Nazis, selling the Reich such things as machinery, steel, and ball bearings. A sub-plan to Fortitude North, Grafum, was a diplomatic operation designed to convince the Germans that Sweden was in negotiations with the Allies. It began with the British making not entirely discreet requests for meteorological data and permission to set up navigational equipment in Sweden. More urgent requests followed. Requests for permission to fly reconnaissance missions over Swedish airspace and for the right to refuel and repair aircraft in Sweden. Rumors were spread that Allied engineers were inspecting Swedish railroads and runways. In June of 1944, Great Britain, the United States, and Russia jointly demanded that in the event of an Allied invasion of Norway, Sweden deny Germany passage for its troops. These diplomatic deceptions were the final piece of a puzzle that showed that Norway was the target of Allied invasion plans.
Hitler consequently kept over 300,000 men garrisoning Norway right through to the end of the war.
Secrets of War will continue in a moment here on the History Channel. We now return to Secrets of War.
Fortitude North and South weren't the only deceptive operations implemented to cover the invasion of Normandy. In the months leading up to D-Day, dozens of other lesser plans were executed throughout Europe and Africa with the same objective: to keep German forces dispersed and to conceal the date and place of the landings. Some of the operations, long secret, have remained obscure. Operation Zeppelin began in January as a cover operation for the assault on Anzio. It continued through July in order to keep German forces in the oil-rich Balkans. Once again, the Allied deception masters used notional forces to imply a threat to another of Germany's sources of raw materials. With so many troops in North Africa, it was a simple matter of rumor and disinformation to create the impression of an army in Tobruk poised for an attack. In fact, only half of the British 12th Army, the Allies' major force in the scenario, was real. The story was spread that at the Tehran Conference, Stalin had requested that the Allies' first offensive of 1944 be directed at the Balkans to hinder German efforts in the south of Russia. Double agents informed the Germans that the Allies planned to attack Greece, Crete, and the Dalmatian coast in late March and April. They then reported that these attacks had been postponed for various reasons until May, and eventually until late June, to pin German forces in the area until after the landings in Normandy. Another Mediterranean deception, codenamed Vendetta, feigned a threat to the Marseille region of southern France. The 7th U.S. Army, based in Algiers, was the primary component of the operation, which once again included notional divisions and the convenient appearance of 2 aircraft carriers in the area. The carriers were simply passing through the region on their way to another destination, but their presence reinforced the illusion of an impending assault. Allied soldiers were given a booklet entitled A Guide to Southern France, some of which just happened to be left behind for the benefit of German spies. The Allies also approached the Spanish government about setting up medical facilities, knowing that the Germans would deduce that an attack from the south was at hand. One component of Vendetta has become famous for its simplicity and audacity. Operation Copperhead began when a British officer involved in cover and deception saw a photograph of a soldier who bore a remarkable resemblance to British Field Marshal Montgomery. Lieutenant Clifton James, a peacetime actor, had little trouble impersonating the famous general.
Montgomery's stand-in lands in Gibraltar, and there's a, quote, leak of the information, so that there's knowledge that Montgomery is in Gibraltar. And it looks like maybe he's starting to set up an invasion of Europe through the Mediterranean. So the Germans have got to keep people also in the Mediterranean.
Also working in the Allies' favor was a burgeoning intelligence network that had gathered and continued to gather massive amounts of data on the disposition and strength of German forces. At the center of this intelligence gathering were the code breakers at Bletchley Park. Early in the war, they'd succeeded in deciphering Enigma, the code used by the German armed forces for tactical-level communications.
But even more importantly was the German Lorentz machine used by the German High Command. And although this had started to be broken in 1942, they hadn't had much success with it, getting it broken in time to be useful, until luckily just before D-Day. And that was caused by the advent of the Colossus computer, which was designed at Dollis Hill in England to help to break this Lorentz cipher. And that was installed here in December 1943, came on stream in January 44, and it suddenly reduced the time to break these very important messages from weeks to hours. And so just in time before D-Day, these very important messages were broken.
The messages decoded by the room-sized Colossus were top-secret communications from the highest levels of the Reich, often between his generals and Hitler himself. These intercepted messages provided the Allies with highly classified and critical information about Axis plans and movements. They also provided proof that Plan Bodyguard was working. The Germans were being deceived about Allied intentions. The benefits of the intelligence gathered by the cryptologists at Bletchley Park cannot be overestimated.
There's never been an operation in the history of the world in which the attacker had more information about the attacked. It was an absolute encyclopedia of information.
All the pieces were in place, but intelligence, availability of materials, and troop readiness were not the only factors considered in choosing the date of the invasion. The planners first had to consider the phase of the moon. A full or nearly full moon was needed to give the pre-dawn maneuvers enough light. The second factor contributing to the choice of time and date was the tide. The flat-bottomed landing craft that were to carry the Allied troops ashore could only land at low tide. The final element in the decision couldn't be controlled or planned. The weather would determine when the liberation of Europe would be possible. The date was set. D-Day would be the 5th of June, 1944. On the 29th of May, a storm was spotted in the Atlantic, heading towards Europe. By the 1st of June, the situation had developed to the degree that Group Captain John Stagg, the chief meteorologist of the Expeditionary Force, advised Allied Supreme Command that the outlook for the 4th, 5th, and quite possibly the 6th was not good. By the 3rd, weather prognosis had not improved. Eisenhower pondered the alternatives. The decision about whether to proceed was his alone. At 4:15 a.m. on Sunday, the 4th of June, with 5,000 ships and hundreds of thousands of men prepared for the initial stage of Operation Neptune, Eisenhower gave his order. D-Day was to be postponed for 24 hours. Suddenly, a year's planning and preparations were in jeopardy. If the assault wasn't launched soon, it would have to be postponed for at least 2 weeks. But would the fragile house of cards that obscured the most vital operation of the war crumble? Could the unloading of so many men and so much material go unnoticed by the Germans? Could the slower ships that had been sent ahead go undetected? Throughout the day, the generals and meteorologists watched and waited in anticipation and apprehension. A wrong forecast could lead to disaster. On the other side of the Channel, the Germans, whose weather ships in the North Atlantic had been sunk by the Allies earlier in the war, now tried to second-guess the Allies' intentions.
There was a conviction within the German armies in France that we would never land in weather like that. When the English Channel gets turbulent, it gets really turbulent. And flat-bottomed landing craft can't land, and great fleets can't maintain their positions when they're at sea. And the air forces are grounded. So that everything combined to ensure that that night Hitler took a sleeping pill and went to bed quite early.
At 9:30 p.m. on the 4th of June, meteorologist Stagg once again secretly met with Eisenhower and the other commanders of the Allied forces at Suffolk House near Portsmouth.
Eisenhower said, well, I don't know whether we can invade in this type of weather. And it was only when Group Captain Stagg, the meteorologist, found a break in the clouds out in the central Atlantic that he was able to make a recommendation: we can start at 0700 tomorrow morning, sir. One of the most dramatic statements of the war.
By 10:45, Eisenhower had weighed his options and calmly said, "We'll go." On the evening of the 5th of June, 1944, the 5,000 ships of the Allied invasion fleet began their journey across the English Channel to the beaches of Normandy and destiny.
Secrets of War will continue in a moment here on the History Channel. We now return to Secrets of War.
The landing had achieved one of its goals, tactical surprise. Confident that the Allies couldn't attack in such weather, many of the German officers assigned to coastal defense were away, leaving some divisions virtually leaderless at one of the most critical moments of the entire war.
Rommel himself went off to attend his wife's birthday party, stopping en route to buy her a pair of shoes in Paris.
I think it's one of the great ironies of the war, and one of the great strokes of luck the Allies had, that Rommel, the most charismatic leader that the German army had at the time, had chosen that time to go home.
But Rommel had done a good job of reinforcing the Atlantic Wall. Even though the German defenders were tactically unprepared, they were well armed and well fortified.
Eisenhower himself was so concerned about the possibility of failure that he's prepared a whole statement, which he was prepared to read, saying that the invasion has failed. So it was in Eisenhower's mind and heart that there was the possibility of failure.
Away from the front lines, the battle of wits and deception continued. In an operation codenamed Titanic, hundreds of dummy paratroops were dropped as soldiers on the ground played recordings of battle sounds through loudspeakers.
At 3 o'clock on the morning of the 6th of June, the reserve regiment of 352 Division was called out, and it spent the morning of D-Day beating the woods for a major airborne landing that wasn't there, instead of being available to put the Omaha Beach landing back into the sea.
Operations Glimmer and Taxable simulated assaults on the coast of France. A half a dozen bombers flying in precise oval patterns ejected foil strips known as window or chaff at 2-minute intervals. Used in conjunction with tug-based barrage balloons and a radar amplification device called moonshine, this technique produced a startling effect.
On a German radar set, this spoof looked like an invading fleet. Comparatively trivial reports of landing in West Normandy got overlooked.
The double-cross system, the British program of passing disinformation to Germany through turned and double agents, transmitted more than 250 messages concerning the invasion. The transmissions were supposed to stop with the landings, but the committee in charge of the program decided that there could be some benefit in continuing the deception.
The agents who are now part of the continent are telling their German spy masters that they're behind the lines as the Allies are moving across France, and they're sending information about troop dispositions, how many railroad cars are going this way and that, and it's all not true. The Germans are still believing it. There was evidence that the German intelligence staff was still believing these agents even as the war came to an end.
One such double agent, Juan Pujol, a Spaniard known as Garbo, was involved in one of the most significant deceptions of the invasion. As Allied troops were en route to the French coast, Garbo transmitted a message warning the Germans that the invasion was imminent, but that the landings in Normandy were only a feint designed to draw German strength there. The message was sent too late for the Germans to act upon, but its receipt strengthened Garbo's already considerable credibility in the eyes of his German controllers. More than a week after the initial landings, with the situation still very tenuous, Hitler, concerned about the massive amounts of men and materials coming ashore in Normandy, finally released the panzer divisions stationed in the Pas-de-Calais to join the battle. It was then that Garbo passed on a critical piece of disinformation, confirming to his German contacts that the real invasion was still to come.
Hitler, receiving the message, called the panzer units back. Once they were stopped and turned around, they were never again committed until Normandy, the beachhead, was established, and it was too late. The entire operation, years of work, finally were culminated in one key critical message.
10 days after the invasion had started, there were actually more enemy troops in the Pas-de-Calais than there were 10 days before the invasion. And after the war, from captured enemy documents, it became perfectly clear that General Jodl, with Hitler's support, had stopped the 1st SS Panzer Division on information from a spy in England, trusted source, codenamed Arabelle. We knew him by the codename Garbo.
The Battle of Normandy storms ahead. American forces have cut a wide path from coast to coast across the Cherbourg Peninsula. Fleets of tanks and guns and transport of all kind continue to pour across the Channel, virtually unmolested.
The Allied liberators punched through the Atlantic Wall and moved inland. Over 9,000 men were killed or wounded on the first day. But by the end of the week, more than 250,000 men had come ashore. The Allies had a foothold. It was the beginning of the end of the war in Europe. The success and importance of Operations Bodyguard and Fortitude cannot be disputed. Documents captured after the war showed that the German High Command had believed some, if not all, of the deception produced by the Allies concerning the invasion of Normandy.
I think that probably the single greatest intelligence coup of the Second World War was the entire deception operation that covered the D-Day landings. You have to understand that the Germans anticipated, they made precisely the same kind of judgments as the Allied military commanders. They knew that an invasion was coming. They knew roughly when it was coming. They didn't know the target.
Of the more than 300 divisions of the mighty Wehrmacht, only 6 were in Normandy on D-Day to repel the Allied landings.
Hitler had huge reserves, which if they'd have been put into the Normandy beachhead on the first day, I'm afraid it would have been curtains for Eisenhower's armies. We couldn't have withstood that. Can you imagine what would have happened if Hitler had managed to get all these divisions together and put them on the Normandy front? We'd never have broken out.
Less than a year after D-Day, the war which had held Europe in its icy grip for 6 years was over. It wasn't until the 1970s, nearly 30 years after the surrender of Germany, that the truths about Bodyguard and Fortitude slowly began to come to light. Some have yet to be revealed, and some may never be known. But for a moment in time, with the fate of the world hanging in the balance, those secrets and the deceptions designed to keep them hidden secured an Allied victory that changed the course of history. From underground war rooms to the beaches of Normandy, much more than truth was protected by a bodyguard of lies.